The ghost of the grandeur, the blood and mud of Panama. In 1881, the most famous man in the world, Ferdinand de Lesseps, the genius who carved the Suez Canal out of the Egyptian desert, arrived in the Panamanian jungle with a gold-plated shovel and a promise to conquer the earth. He didn't bring doctors, he didn't bring engineers who understood the terrain. He brought his ego. 10 years later, $287 million had vanished. 22,000 men were buried in unmarked graves, and the jungle was winning. This is the 40,000-word epic of the Panama Canal, a saga of blood, mud, and the birth of the American century. The story of the Panama Canal did not begin with a shovel. It began with a delusion of grandeur in the glittering ballrooms of Paris. It was the winter of 1879, and Ferdinand de Lesseps was a god among men. He had successfully completed the Suez Canal, a feat that had eluded empires since the time of the pharaohs. In the eyes of the French public, de Lesseps was the Le Grand Français, the man who could bend nature to his will. But de Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a diplomat with a silver tongue and a dangerous addiction to his own legend. When he stood before a crowded assembly in Paris and declared that he would carve a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, the crowd erupted in a fever of nationalistic pride. Thousands of ordinary French citizens, bakers, teachers, and widows poured their life savings into the venture, buying shares in the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interocéanique. They believed that if de Lesseps said the oceans could meet, then the oceans would obey. But Panama was not Egypt. Egypt was a flat, dry desert where the primary challenge was moving sand. Panama was a prehistoric nightmare. It was a land of jagged volcanic mountains, impenetrable rainforests, and the Chagres River, a serpent of water that could rise 20 feet in a single night of torrential rain. Most importantly, Panama was the capital of the Black Vomit. Yellow fever and malaria were so prevalent that the indigenous populations lived in a state of permanent, low-level infection, while any foreigner who stepped off the boat was essentially signing their own death warrant. On December 30th, 1881, the first group of French engineers and young idealistic laborers arrived at the port of Cologne. They stepped off the steamships into a landscape that felt like a fever dream. The humidity was so thick it felt like breathing warm soup. The noise of the jungle, the screeching of howler monkeys, and the incessant buzz of insects was a constant, maddening roar. De Lesseps had insisted on a sea-level canal, a massive trench cut through the mountains that would require no locks. It was a beautiful idea on paper, but it ignored the reality of the Culebra Cut, a mountain of shifting clay and rock that stood in their way. As the first shovels hit the ground, the tragedy began to unfold with terrifying speed. The French brought massive steam shovels and machinery designed for the dry sands of Suez, only to find that in the Panamanian rain, the equipment sank into the mud until only the smokestacks were visible. The work was grueling, backbreaking, and increasingly hopeless. But the mud was the least of their problems. Within weeks of arrival, the young French men from the countryside began to fall. It started with a headache, a high fever, and a bone-deep ache. Then came the jaundice, turning their skin a sickly yellow, followed by the black vomit, the internal hemorrhaging that signaled the end. The French medical establishment, the best in the world at the time, was baffled. They believed in the miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by the bad air rising from the rotting vegetation of the jungle floor. They told the men to stay away from the swamps at night and to avoid the smell of the damp earth. In the hospital at Ancon, the Sisters of Charity did their best to comfort the dying. In a cruel irony of history, they placed the legs of the hospital beds in small bowls of water to prevent ants from crawling on to the patients. They did not realize they were creating thousands of tiny, perfect nurseries for the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the true carrier of yellow fever. The very places meant for healing became the most efficient killing fields in the country. The mortality rate among the French staff was staggering. In some months, 1 out of every 10 Europeans died. One young engineer arrived with his wife and 3 children, and within a month, he was the only one left alive. De Lesseps, back in Paris, refused to believe the reports. He called the stories of the fever exaggerations and unpatriotic rumors. He continued to raise more money, spinning tales of glorious progress, while his directors in Panama were secretly buying thousands of coffins in bulk from New York to save on shipping costs. The project had become a black hole, a Tower of Babel built of mud and bone. By 1889, the company was bankrupt, the dream was shattered, and Panama was a graveyard of 22,000 men. The jungle moved back in, vines curling around the rusted skeletons of the French machinery, waiting for the next empire to try its hand at the impossible. The land divided, the world united. The failure of the French was not just a financial disaster. It was a psychological wound that bled across the Atlantic. For a decade, the rusted carcasses of French steam shovels sat in the Panamanian mud like the bones of dead giants. But in 1901, an assassin's bullet in Buffalo, New York, placed a man of volcanic energy into the American presidency, Theodore Roosevelt. TR didn't just want a canal, he wanted a great highway that would link the American Navy and ensure the United States dominated both the Atlantic and the Pacific. He looked at the French graveyard and saw not a warning, but a challenge. However, there was a problem. Colombia belonged to Colombia, and the Colombian Senate, weary of American gunboat diplomacy, refused to sign Roosevelt's treaty. They wanted more money and more respect. Roosevelt, a man who believed in walking softly and carrying a big stick, had no patience for the slow grind of international law. In a series of secret meetings at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, American agents and Panamanian rebels cooked up a revolution. On November 3, 1903, the U.S. Navy steamed into the port of Colón, effectively blockading the Colombian army while the Panamanians declared independence. It was a bloodless coup, manufactured in Washington, and 3 days later, the United States recognized the new Republic of Panama. Within a week, the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty was signed, giving the U.S. permanent control over a 10-mile-wide strip of land, the Canal Zone. When the Americans arrived in 1904, they were greeted by the same ancient, humid nightmare that had swallowed the French. The town of Colón was a pest hole of open sewers and rotting wharves. The Americans brought a new philosophy, industrial efficiency, but the jungle didn't care about American grit. Within months, workers were fleeing the site in a panic as yellow fever began its harvest. Roosevelt realized that to build the canal, he first had to kill the jungle. He appointed two titans to lead the charge: John Stevens, a rugged, tobacco-chewing railroad engineer, and Dr. William Gorgas, a quiet army physician with a radical theory. Gorgas had served in Cuba and was convinced that the miasma theory was a lie. He believed the killer wasn't the bad air, but a tiny, fragile insect, the Aedes aegypti mosquito. At first, the American political establishment laughed at him. They called his idea the mosquito nonsense. But Stevens, seeing his workers die, gave Gorgas a blank check. What followed was the most massive public health campaign in human history. Gorgas turned the canal zone into a military-grade sanitation project. He ordered every house in Panama to be screened. He sent mosquito brigades into every swamp, every puddle, and every rain barrel, pouring millions of gallons of oil and Panama larvicide onto the water to suffocate the mosquito larvae. They fumigated every building, sometimes multiple times. It was a war of extermination against an invisible enemy. By 1906, for the first time in centuries, the black vomit had vanished from Panama. The greatest barrier to the canal, the fever, had been conquered by science. With the fever gone, John Stevens turned the project into a massive railroad operation. He realized the French had failed because they had nowhere to put the dirt. He built a complex moving railway that allowed dirt trains to run in a continuous loop, hauling millions of tons of earth out of the mountains. But the labor was segregated by a cruel gold and silver system. Gold employees, mostly white Americans, were paid in U.S. currency and lived in luxury. Silver employees, tens of thousands of black laborers from Barbados, Jamaica, and the West Indies, were paid in Panamanian silver and lived in cramped, dangerous barracks. These silver men were the true backbone of the canal. They were the ones who handled the unstable dynamite and stood in the path of the mountain slides. In the Culebra Cut, a 9-mile stretch through the Continental Divide, the earth fought back. The clay was so unstable that a single blast of dynamite could trigger a landslide that would bury a month's worth of work and dozens of men in a single afternoon. The mountains seemed to flow like liquid. One worker described it as trying to dig a hole in a bowl of porridge. The psychological toll was immense. Stevens, the man who had designed the system, eventually buckled under the pressure. In 1907, he resigned, telling Roosevelt that the canal had become a killing machine for his nerves. Roosevelt, furious at the resignation, declared that from now on, the canal would be run by the military. He appointed Colonel George Washington Goethals, a man who wouldn't quit because he was a soldier who followed orders. The Americans were no longer just digging a ditch, they were creating a new landscape. They decided to abandon the French sea-level plan and instead build a bridge of water. They would dam the Chagres River to create Gatun Lake, the largest man-made lake in the world at the time, and use a system of colossal concrete locks to lift 50,000-ton ships 85 feet into the air. This was the birth of modern engineering. They were building the largest dam on Earth and the most complex electrical system ever designed, all while the Earth continued to slide and the tropical sun threatened to melt their resolve. The Americans had the technology, they had the medicine, and they had the money. But the mountain known as Culebra was waiting for its final bloody confrontation.
The triumph of the Titans and the blood on the gates. The final phase of the Panama Canal was not a victory of machines, but a war of attrition against the very crust of the earth. When Colonel George Washington Goethals took command in 1907, he brought a cold military discipline to the jungle. There would be no more resignations, no more nerves, and no more doubt. He turned the canal zone into a benevolent dictatorship, a society where every man was a gear in a massive steam-powered clock. But as the Americans reached the deepest part of the Continental Divide, the infamous Culebra Cut, the planet itself seemed to rebel against the intrusion. The Culebra Cut was a 9-mile canyon of hell. The heat at the bottom of the trench often soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius, trapped between walls of red clay and volcanic rock. The air was a thick soup of coal smoke from the hundreds of steam shovels and locomotives working in the abyss. But the true terror was the slides. Because the rock was composed of unstable shale and clay, the weight of the mountains caused the floor of the canal to literally bulge upward, flipping locomotives like toys. In a single night, 1 million cubic yards of earth would slide back into the trench, erasing 6 months of backbreaking labor. To combat this, the Americans used dynamite on a scale never seen in human history. They were using 600,000 pounds of explosives every month. The powder men, mostly black Caribbean laborers, had to hand-drill holes into the rock and pack them with unstable dynamite while the tropical sun beat down. One stray spark, one premature detonation, and an entire work crew would be vaporized, leaving nothing behind but their boots. Between 1904 and 1914, over 5,600 workers died in the American phase alone, crushed by landslides, blown apart by dynamite, or mangled by the iron monsters, the steam shovels. As the trench was finalized, the focus shifted to the lungs of the canal, the locks. These were the greatest concrete structures the world had ever seen. They were massive water elevators, 1,000 feet long and 110 feet wide, with walls as thick as a 6-story building. To move the 700-ton steel gates, the Americans designed a revolutionary electrical system, powered by the very water they were taming. This was the first large-scale use of electricity in the world, a precursor to the modern age. The gates were so perfectly balanced that a single 40-horsepower motor could swing them shut. In 1913, the two ends of the project finally met. The Gatun Dam had been completed, creating the massive Gatun Lake by flooding 164 square miles of jungle, swallowing ancient villages and thousands of acres of forest. On October 10, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson pushed a button in the White House, sending a telegraph signal thousands of miles to Panama. In a spectacular explosion, the Gamboa Dike was blown apart, and the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific finally touched. The official opening on August 15, 1914, was a somber, quiet affair. The world's attention was elsewhere. The guns of August had just signaled the start of World War I in Europe. As the SS Ancon made the official transit, there were no world leaders present, only the men who had bled for the dirt. The ship glided through the locks, lifted by the invisible hand of gravity and the sheer will of the 45,000 laborers who had survived. The Panama Canal was the moon landing of the early 20th century. It shortened the journey from New York to San Francisco by nearly 8,000 miles, changing the geometry of global trade forever. But the cost was staggering. Between the French and American attempts, nearly 30,000 lives were lost, roughly 500 deaths for every mile of the canal. The story of the Panama Canal is the story of the American century. It proved that if enough money, enough ego, and enough blood, humanity could literally move mountains and divide continents. Theodore Roosevelt later famously said,
I took the canal zone and let Congress debate, and while the debate goes on, the canal does also. It remains a monument to human genius and human hubris, a bridge of water built on a foundation of bone, proving that nature can be conquered, but never without a price that haunts the victors for generations. Epilogue: The Legacy of the Jungle. Today, the Panama Canal remains one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. Thousands of ships pass through its gates every year, marveling at the same concrete walls poured by men over a century ago. The silver men of the Caribbean, whose names were never recorded in the glorious histories of the time, are the silent ghosts of the grandeur. Their labor created the modern world, proving that the greatest feats of civilization are often built by those the world chooses to forget. The jungle still tries to move back in, the rains still fall, and the Culebra Cut still shifts, but the oceans remain joined, a permanent scar on the earth that changed the destiny of mankind.